David stood by his mailbox, sorting through the usual stack of bills and advertisements. It was a Tuesday morning, and he was already running late for work. But then his hand stopped on an official-looking envelope with a government seal. The return address made his stomach drop. It was from the city's Department of Public Works. He tore it open right there on the sidewalk, his coffee getting cold in his other hand. The words on the page didn't make sense at first. He had to read them twice, then 3 times. The city was demolishing the old Riverside Cemetery to build a new highway extension. All families with relatives buried there had 90 days to arrange for relocation of their loved ones to the new municipal cemetery on the east side of town. David felt his legs go weak. His mother had been buried at Riverside 15 years ago. 15 long years since he'd said goodbye to her. 15 years since he'd watched them lower her casket into the ground while rain poured down on the small gathering of family and friends. He walked back inside his house and sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the letter. His hands were shaking slightly. The thought of disturbing his mother's grave felt wrong on every level. She was at peace. Why did they have to do this now? His mother, Helen, had been the center of his world growing up. After his father left when David was just 8 years old, it had been just the two of them against everything. She worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. During the day, she worked at a dry cleaning shop, and 3 nights a week she cleaned offices downtown. David remembered falling asleep to the sound of her sewing machine as she altered clothes for extra money. She never complained. Not once. Even when she was exhausted, she'd still help him with his homework and make sure he had clean clothes for school. She'd saved every penny she could so he could go to college, something she never got to do herself. When she died at 65, it felt sudden and unfair. The doctors said it was her heart. She'd been feeling tired for weeks but refused to see a doctor because she didn't want to waste money. By the time David convinced her to go to the hospital, it was too late. She died 3 days later, and David had blamed himself ever since. If only he'd pushed harder. If only he'd noticed sooner. Now at 38 years old, David had built a decent life. He worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm. He'd married Patricia 7 years ago, and they had 2 kids, Tommy and Lisa, ages 5 and 3. His mother never got to meet them, which was another source of quiet grief he carried. His kids would never know the amazing woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. David looked at the letter again. There was a list of approved funeral homes attached, along with instructions for the exhumation and reburial process. The city would cover some costs, but families were responsible for new burial plots and any additional services they wanted. He hadn't been back to his mother's grave in over a year. The thought filled him with guilt. Life just got so busy with work and the kids. Patricia had suggested they visit on Mother's Day, but Tommy had come down with a fever that weekend and they'd stayed home. Then summer came with its chaos of swimming lessons and family vacations. The months just slipped away. That evening, David sat Patricia down after the kids were in bed. He showed her the letter, watching her face as she read it. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she said, reaching for his hand. "That must have been such a shock." "I don't want to do this," David admitted, his voice cracking slightly. The thought of them digging up her grave, moving her like she's just some object to be relocated. "It feels disrespectful." Patricia squeezed his hand. "I know it does. But you don't really have a choice, do you? And maybe in a way it could be good. The new cemetery is closer to our house. You could visit more often. The kids could learn about their grandmother." David knew she was trying to help, but it didn't make him feel any better. Still, she was right. He didn't have a choice. The letter made that clear. If families didn't arrange for relocation within the 90-day window, the city would handle it themselves and place the remains in a common area of the new cemetery, with just a small marker. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering the day of his mother's funeral. It had been a cold April morning, with rain that seemed to come out of nowhere. Only about 20 people had shown up. His mother had been a private person who kept to herself. Most of her old friends had either moved away or passed on themselves. The funeral director that day had been an older man with kind eyes. David couldn't remember his name now. The service had been simple, just like his mother would have wanted. No fuss, no grand speeches. The pastor from the neighborhood church where she occasionally attended had said a few words about kindness and sacrifice. David had been too numb to really hear any of it. He remembered standing at the graveside watching the casket slowly descend into the ground. Someone had handed him a rose to throw in, but his hands had been shaking so badly that he'd dropped it before he could toss it properly. The flower had fallen onto the muddy ground next to the grave. He'd felt like that moment summed up everything. Even in saying goodbye, he'd messed it up. The next morning, David called the first funeral home on the city's approved list. A woman with a pleasant voice answered and listened patiently as he explained the situation. Her name was Jennifer, and she'd handled many cemetery relocations before. "I understand this is difficult," she said gently, "but I want you to know that we treat these situations with the utmost respect and dignity. Your mother will be handled with care every step of the way." She explained the process in detail. They would need to schedule a date for the exhumation, which typically happened in the early morning to maintain privacy. David could be present if he wished, though many families chose not to attend. The coffin would be carefully removed, inspected to ensure it was sealed properly, and then transported to the new cemetery for reburial. "How long does it take?" David asked. "The actual exhumation usually takes about 2 to 3 hours depending on various factors. The ground conditions, the burial vault type, things like that. Then we transport everything to the new location, and the reburial happens the same day or the next day depending on your preference." David made an appointment for 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning. He took the day off work, telling his boss it was for a family matter. He didn't go into details. How do you explain something like this to people who've never been through it? The weeks crawled by slowly. David found himself thinking about his mother constantly. Little memories would pop up at random times. The way she hummed while cooking dinner. How she'd saved the comics section from the Sunday paper for him, because she knew they were his favorite. The proud look on her face when he graduated from college. The first person in their family to get a degree. He drove out to Riverside Cemetery one Saturday afternoon while Patricia took the kids to the park. He hadn't told her where he was going. He just needed to see the grave one more time before everything changed. The cemetery looked different than he remembered. Smaller somehow, or maybe he'd just gotten used to seeing things differently as an adult. He parked near the main gate and walked through the rows of headstones until he found hers. The stone was simple gray granite with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved Mother," carved into it. He'd chosen those words himself, though now they seemed inadequate. How do you sum up a person's entire life in 2 words? Weeds had grown up around the base of the headstone. David knelt down and pulled them out, feeling guilty that he'd let it get this way. His mother had always kept their small apartment immaculate no matter how tired she was. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, not caring if anyone heard him talking to a grave. "I'm sorry I haven't been here more. I'm sorry about what's going to happen next week." A breeze rustled through the old oak trees that lined the cemetery. For just a moment, David felt a sense of peace, like maybe his mother understood, or maybe he was just telling himself that to feel better. He stayed there for almost an hour, just sitting on the grass next to the grave, telling his mother about his kids and his life. He told her about Tommy's obsession with dinosaurs and Lisa's habit of singing made-up songs at the top of her lungs. He told her about Patricia and how she took such good care of their family. He wished, not for the first time, that they could have known each other. When Thursday morning finally arrived, David's alarm went off at 5 in the morning. He'd barely slept. Patricia rolled over and hugged him before he got up. "Are you sure you want to go?" she asked. "Jennifer said you didn't have to be there." "I need to," David said. "She was alone too much in her life. I won't let her be alone for this." He dressed in dark clothes and drove through the empty pre-dawn streets to Riverside Cemetery. Jennifer's car was already there, along with a white van from the funeral home and a truck from the cemetery. 3 workers stood near the vehicles drinking coffee and talking quietly. Jennifer approached him with a sympathetic smile. "Good morning, David. I know this isn't easy. We're going to take good care of everything." David just nodded, not trusting his voice. They all walked together through the cemetery, their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. His mother would have liked that. She'd always been an early riser, someone who appreciated the quiet of morning. When they reached the grave, the workers began setting up their equipment. Jennifer explained each step as they went, but David only half listened. He couldn't take his eyes off his mother's headstone. The workers started digging carefully, using both small machinery and hand tools. The sound of shovels striking dirt filled the air. David watched, feeling numb as they removed layer after layer of earth. It took longer than he expected. 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun climbed higher in the sky. David's legs ached from standing, but he refused to sit down. He'd promised himself he'd see this through. Finally, one of the workers called out. They'd reached the burial vault, the concrete container that held the coffin. Jennifer walked over to inspect, then turned to David with an odd expression on her face. "David," she said carefully, "could you come here for a moment?" Something in her voice made his heart start racing. He walked over on shaky legs and looked down into the excavated grave. The workers had cleared the dirt from the top of the vault and were preparing to lift the lid, but even from where he stood, David could see something was wrong. The vault looked different than he remembered from the funeral, cleaner, newer. And there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. As the workers lifted the coffin out of the vault, Jennifer's face went pale. She held up her hand to stop them from moving it further. Then she turned to David, and he could see confusion and concern in her eyes. "David," she said slowly, "we have a serious problem. This coffin, it's not what we expected. The nameplate says something different." David stepped closer, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He looked at the brass nameplate on the coffin's side, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath him. The name on the plate wasn't his mother's. It wasn't Helen Chen at all. It was someone completely different, someone he'd never heard of in his life. And in that moment, standing in that excavated grave with the morning sun beating down on them, David realized that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong 15 years ago. The coffin they'd just pulled from his mother's grave contained someone else entirely. David stared at the nameplate, reading it over and over again, hoping the words would somehow change, but they didn't. The brass plate clearly read Margaret Foster, 1952-2011. Not his mother's name. Not his mother's birth year. Not even the same year she died. His legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the grass. Jennifer was talking, her voice sounding distant and muffled like he was underwater. The cemetery workers had stopped what they were doing and were standing around awkwardly, not sure what to do next. "This can't be right," David finally managed to say. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I was here. I watched them bury my mother in this exact spot. I visited this grave. This is her headstone." Jennifer knelt down beside him, her professional composure cracking slightly. In all her years handling cemetery relocations, she'd never encountered anything like this. "David, I need you to take a deep breath. We're going to figure this out, but right now I need to make some phone calls." She pulled out her cell phone and walked a few feet away, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. David could hear fragments of the conversation. Words like wrong body and major problem and contact the police floated through the morning air. The police. The word hit David like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something serious. If this woman, whoever Margaret Foster was, had been buried in his mother's grave, then where was his mother? One of the cemetery workers, an older man with weathered hands and kind eyes, sat down on the grass near David. "Son," he said gently, "I've been working at cemeteries for 35 years. I've seen mix-ups before, back in the old days when record-keeping wasn't computerized. It's rare, but it happens. We're going to sort this out." David wanted to believe him, but his mind was spinning. He thought back to his mother's funeral 15 years ago. Had he actually seen them place the coffin in the ground? He'd been so consumed by grief that day, so numb with loss. The details were fuzzy now. He remembered standing in the rain, remembered the pastor's words, remembered people offering their condolences. But the actual burial, the lowering of the coffin, that part was hazy in his memory. 20 minutes later, a police car pulled into the cemetery. A detective stepped out, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a no-nonsense expression. She introduced herself as Detective Linda Morrison. She shook David's hand and offered her condolences before turning to Jennifer. "Walk me through what happened here," Morrison said, pulling out a notebook. Jennifer explained the entire situation, the city's cemetery relocation project, the exhumation that morning, the discovery of the wrong name on the coffin. Morrison listened carefully, asking questions and taking detailed notes. Then she turned to David. "Mr. Chen, I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. First, tell me about your mother's funeral. What funeral home handled the arrangements?" David's mind felt foggy, but he tried to remember. It was Preston and Sons Funeral Home. They're over on 5th Street, or at least they used to be. I don't even know if they're still in business, Morrison made a note. And you were definitely present at the burial? Yes, I was there the whole time. It was April 18th, 2010. It rained that day. There weren't many people, maybe 20 at most. David paused, trying to pull up more details. The funeral director was an older man. I can't remember his name. He was kind, though, gentle. He seemed to understand what we were going through. We? Morrison asked. My aunt was there. My mother's sister, Catherine. She lives in Florida now. We don't talk much anymore. There was some tension in the family after Mom died. David didn't want to get into the details of how his aunt had criticized the funeral arrangements, saying they were too cheap, not elaborate enough. She'd wanted an open casket viewing, but David's mother had specifically requested a closed casket in her will. Morrison continued asking questions. Had David noticed anything unusual at the funeral? Had the funeral home given him any paperwork about the burial plot? Did he have his mother's death certificate? David answered as best he could, but everything from that time period felt like it had happened in a dream. Grief had a way of blurring memories, making everything soft around the edges. Here's what we need to do, Morrison said after she'd finished her questions. First, we need to verify what's actually in this coffin. I'm going to need your permission to open it, or I can get a warrant, but that will take more time. David felt sick. The thought of opening a coffin, of seeing a dead body, made his stomach turn, but he needed to know the truth. Do it, he said quietly. Jennifer called over her staff from the funeral home. They had the equipment needed to safely open the coffin. Everyone stood back as 2 workers carefully removed the coffin lid. David couldn't bring himself to look at first. He turned away, his hands shaking. Mr. Chen, Detective Morrison said after a moment, her voice softer now. You don't need to look if you don't want to. But I can confirm that the deceased in this coffin is definitely not a 65-year-old woman who died in 2010. Based on the nameplate information and what we're seeing, this appears to be an elderly woman who was likely in her late 50s when she passed. David forced himself to glance over. He could only see the outline of a body, covered in the deteriorated remains of burial clothes. He looked away immediately. It wasn't his mother. That much was clear. But seeing a stranger's body in what should have been his mother's grave felt surreal and deeply wrong. Morrison made several more phone calls. Within the hour, 2 more officers arrived, along with a representative from the city's cemetery management office. Everyone stood around the open grave discussing what to do next. The cemetery representative, a nervous young man named Kevin, pulled up records on his tablet. According to our digital records, which were transferred from paper files in 2015, this plot was purchased by Helen Chen in 2009, and she was interred here on April 18, 2010, but obviously, something went wrong. We need to check the funeral home's records, Morrison said, and we need to locate any other burials that happened around that same time period. If bodies got mixed up, there's a chance that Helen Chen was buried somewhere else under someone else's name. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Patricia. He'd forgotten to text her to let her know what was happening. He stepped away from the group and answered. Hey, how's it going? She asked, her voice cheerful. Are you almost done? David didn't know where to start. Patricia, something's wrong. Really wrong. Can you call your mom and see if she can watch the kids for a while? I need you to come down here. The worry in his voice must have been obvious because Patricia's tone immediately changed. What happened? Are you okay? I'm okay, but just please come. I'll explain everything when you get here. 45 minutes later, Patricia arrived at the cemetery. David met her at the gate and explained everything that had happened. She stood there in shock, her hand over her mouth. Oh my God, David, where's your mom then? That's what we're trying to figure out. David felt exhausted, like he'd been awake for days instead of just a few hours. By early afternoon, Detective Morrison had gathered more information. She'd sent an officer to Preston and Sons Funeral Home, only to discover that the business had closed 2 years ago. The building was now a coffee shop. However, the funeral home's records had been transferred to the county clerk's office. As required by law, Morrison went through those records herself, pulling up everything related to burials in April and May of 2010. What she found made her face go grim. Mr. Chen, she said, calling David over to where she'd set up a makeshift workspace on the hood of her car, papers spread everywhere. I found something. There were 6 burials handled by Preston and Sons in April 2010, all at this cemetery. Your mother's was one of them. Margaret Foster, the woman whose name is on that coffin, was buried on April 25th, exactly 1 week after your mother. David's heart started pounding. So they mixed them up? That's what it looks like. But it gets more complicated. Preston and Sons went out of business in 2012, but not before there were several complaints filed against them. Administrative issues, missed paperwork, billing problems. The owner, a man named Robert Tillman, was let go in early 2012. The business limped along for another 6 months under new management before closing entirely. Where's Tillman now? David asked. Morrison sighed. That's the challenging part. I tracked him down. He's in a nursing care facility in the next county. According to the facility staff, he's suffering from advanced dementia. He probably won't be able to answer any questions coherently. David felt his hope deflating. If the man responsible for this mess couldn't explain what happened, how would they ever figure out where his mother was? But Morrison wasn't finished. Here's what I think happened based on the records. Your mother and Margaret Foster died within a week of each other. Both were around the same age. Both had similar funeral arrangements. Both were buried at this cemetery. I think somewhere in the process, the coffins or the burial plots got mixed up. So my mother is buried in Margaret Foster's plot? David asked. Possibly. According to the records, Margaret Foster was supposed to be buried in Section C, Plot 47. Your mother was in Section B, Plot 23, where we are now. I'm going to send officers to check Foster's plot. 2 officers were dispatched to Section C. David, Patricia, Jennifer, and Detective Morrison waited by David's mother's open grave. The coffin had been carefully sealed again and moved to the funeral home's van. The cemetery workers had been sent home. Now it was just the waiting. David's phone rang. It was his boss, wondering why he hadn't called in with an update. David stepped away and explained that it was a family emergency and he'd need at least the rest of the week off. His boss, thankfully, was understanding and told him to take all the time he needed. Patricia held his hand as they waited. No matter what happens, she said quietly, we'll get through this. Your mom deserves to be laid to rest properly, and we're going to make sure that happens. An hour later, Detective Morrison's radio crackled to life. The officers at Margaret Foster's plot were reporting in. Morrison listened, her expression neutral, then nodded. She walked over to David and Patricia. They've checked the records and the plot location. Margaret Foster's grave is there in Section C. The headstone has her name, her dates, everything correct. But here's the thing. According to the ground disturbance analysis, that grave was definitely opened and closed around the same time as your mother's in 2010. So someone's buried there, David said. Yes. And given what we've found here, there's a strong possibility it's your mother, but we won't know for certain until we get authorization to exhume that grave as well. David felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The thought of going through another exhumation, of potentially finding his mother in someone else's grave, was almost too much to bear. What about Margaret Foster's family? Patricia asked. Don't they need to give permission? Morrison nodded. We're working on that. According to the records, Foster had no immediate family. She was a widow with no children, but she had a niece listed as next of kin, a woman named Dorothy Banks who lives in Ohio. We've got officers trying to reach her now. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and waiting. David and Patricia sat on a bench near the cemetery office, drinking coffee that Jennifer had brought them from a nearby cafe. David's mind kept replaying the moment he'd seen the wrong name on that coffin. How could something like this happen? How could a funeral home mix up 2 people? As the sun started to set, Detective Morrison finally had news. They'd reached Dorothy Banks. She was shocked to hear about the situation, but gave permission for the exhumation of her aunt's grave. More than that, she admitted something that made the picture clearer. Miss Banks said she always had doubts about her aunt's burial, Morrison explained. She said the funeral home gave her a piece of jewelry that was supposedly on her aunt's body, but it wasn't anything she recognized. She thought maybe the nursing home had gotten her aunt's belongings mixed up before she died, so she didn't pursue it. But now, hearing about this situation, she's wondering if there wasn't a bigger mix-up. What was the jewelry? David asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. A jade bracelet. Chinese, apparently. Quite distinctive. David's blood went cold. His mother had owned a jade bracelet. His grandfather had given it to her when David was born. She'd worn it every single day of her life. David had specifically asked the funeral home to make sure she was buried with it. It was one of the few valuable things she'd owned, and he couldn't bear the thought of it being anywhere but with her. "My mother had a bracelet like that," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was supposed to be buried with it." Morrison's eyes met his, and he could see understanding dawn in them. "Then I think we know where your mother is." The jade bracelet. That single detail changed everything. David sat in Detective Morrison's car, holding his head in his hands. Patricia rubbed his back gently, not saying anything because there was nothing to say. After 15 years of believing his mother was resting in one place, she'd actually been somewhere else entirely, buried under a stranger's name. "We need to move quickly on this," Morrison said, closing her phone after yet another call. "Miss Banks is flying in tomorrow morning from Ohio. She wants to be present for the exhumation of her aunt's grave. Given the circumstances and the evidence we have about the bracelet, the county judge has approved an emergency exhumation order." "When?" David asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "Tomorrow afternoon. I know this is a lot to process, but we need to resolve this as quickly as possible, both for your family and for Miss Banks." David nodded numbly. Patricia spoke up, her voice steady and practical in the way that had always grounded him. "What do we need to do to prepare?" Morrison explained the process. They'd meet at the cemetery at 2 o'clock the next day. The same funeral home team would handle the exhumation. David could be present if he wanted, but Morrison gently suggested that maybe this time he should consider waiting elsewhere. "I have to be there," David said firmly. "If it's my mother, I need to know. I can't wait somewhere else while other people tell me what they found. I just can't." That evening, David and Patricia drove home in silence. The kids were still at Patricia's mother's house. Patricia had called earlier and asked if they could keep the children overnight, explaining only that there was a family situation that needed attention. Her mother, bless her, hadn't asked too many questions. David couldn't eat dinner. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at an old photo album his mother had kept. There were pictures of him as a baby, as a toddler, as a young boy. In almost every photo where his mother appeared, he could see that jade bracelet on her wrist. It had been such a constant presence in his life that he'd almost stopped noticing it. He remembered asking her about it once when he was maybe 7 or 8 years old. She'd smiled and told him that his grandfather had brought it back from a trip to China, back when such trips were rare and special. The bracelet was supposed to bring good fortune and protection. She'd treasured it not because of its monetary value, but because it connected her to her father, who had died before David was born. "I'll give it to your wife someday," she'd told him once when he was in college. "When you find the right person and settle down. It should stay in the family." But when she died, David couldn't bear the thought of removing it from her. The bracelet belonged with her. It had been part of who she was. So he'd specifically requested that the funeral home leave it on her wrist when they prepared her for burial. Now, knowing that some stranger had been given his mother's bracelet, that this woman Dorothy Banks had it somewhere, made David feel violated in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't really about the bracelet itself. It was about what it represented. Another piece of his mother that had been lost, misplaced, treated carelessly. Patricia sat down next to him and looked at the photos. "She was beautiful," she said softly. "I wish I could have known her." "She would have loved you," David said, and it was true. His mother had always wanted him to find someone kind, someone steady. Patricia was both of those things and more, and she would have absolutely adored the kids. "Tommy has her sense of humor, you know, that dry wit. And Lisa has her stubbornness," Patricia smiled. "That's a good thing. Stubbornness gets you through life." That night, David barely slept again. He kept imagining his mother, alone in the wrong grave all these years. Had she been peaceful? Did it matter where a body was buried? Or was he just projecting his own feelings onto a situation that his mother, wherever her spirit was, probably didn't care about? But it mattered to him. It mattered that she'd been treated carelessly. It mattered that the funeral home had made such a catastrophic mistake. It mattered that he'd been visiting the wrong grave, leaving flowers for a stranger. Morning came slowly. David got up early and made coffee, standing by the kitchen window and watching the sunrise. Patricia found him there an hour later. "We should eat something," she said. "It's going to be a long day." They went through the motions of breakfast, though David could barely taste anything. At noon, Patricia's mother brought the kids home. Tommy ran to David immediately, hugging his legs. "Daddy!" "Grandma let us have ice cream for dinner." Despite everything, David smiled. Did she now? That was nice of Grandma. Patricia's mother gave David a knowing look. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," he said, which was only partly true. They left the kids with Patricia's mother again and drove to Riverside Cemetery. David felt like he'd spent more time at this cemetery in the past 2 days than he had in the previous 5 years combined. The irony wasn't lost on him. Detective Morrison was already there, along with Jennifer and her funeral home staff. There was also a woman David didn't recognize standing near Morrison's car. She was probably in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and a worn cardigan despite the warm afternoon. Morrison made the introductions. "David, Patricia, this is Dorothy Banks. Miss Banks, this is David Chen and his wife." Dorothy stepped forward and, to David's surprise, pulled him into a gentle hug. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry this happened to both our families." David hugged her back, feeling tears prick his eyes. "I'm sorry too. About your aunt." Dorothy pulled back and wiped her eyes. "My Aunt Margaret was a good woman. She spent 40 years as a school teacher. Never married, never had kids of her own, but she loved her students. She deserved better than this confusion." They walked together to Section C, Plot 47. The grave was in a quieter part of the cemetery, near a large oak tree. The headstone read, "Margaret Foster, beloved aunt and teacher." Fresh flowers sat in a vase by the stone. "I try to visit once a year," Dorothy explained, seeing David notice the flowers. "I brought those yesterday when I flew in. I had no idea that today I'd be learning she might not even be buried here." The cemetery workers began the exhumation process. It was just like the day before. The careful digging, the slow revelation of the burial vault, the methodical process of bringing the coffin to the surface. David stood between Patricia and Dorothy, the three of them united in their shared anxiety and hope. This time David knew what to expect, but that didn't make it any easier. Watching the coffin emerge from the ground felt surreal. Detective Morrison supervised everything, making sure photographs were taken for evidence, making sure every step was documented properly. When the coffin finally sat on the ground beside the open grave, Jennifer approached it carefully with one of her staff members. They brushed away the remaining dirt and examined the nameplate. Jennifer looked up at David, and he could see the answer in her face before she said anything. The nameplate says Helen Chen, 1945-2010. David's knees buckled. Patricia caught him, holding him up as emotion crashed over him in waves. Relief, anger, grief, confusion all mixed together until he couldn't tell one feeling from another. Dorothy was crying too. "So my aunt really was in the other grave?" "It appears so," Morrison said gently. "But we need to open this coffin to be absolutely certain." David nodded, unable to speak. Jennifer's team worked carefully, removing the coffin lid with practiced precision. David forced himself to look this time. He had to know for sure. The body inside had clearly been there for 15 years. The burial clothes were deteriorated, the features of the deceased no longer clear. But there were things David recognized immediately. The dress his mother had been buried in, a simple blue one that had been her favorite. The way her hands were folded. And there on her wrist, tarnished but unmistakable, was the jade bracelet. "That's her," David whispered. "That's my mother." Detective Morrison stepped forward. "Mr. Chen, I need you to look at the bracelet. Can you positively identify it as belonging to your mother?" David moved closer, Patricia supporting his arm. The bracelet looked exactly as he remembered it. Pale green jade with gold filigree work, slightly worn from decades of daily wear. There was even a tiny chip on one of the jade pieces, something that had happened when his mother had caught it on a door handle years ago. "That's hers," David said firmly. "I'd recognize it anywhere. My grandfather gave it to her. She wore it every single day." Dorothy spoke up quietly. "The funeral home gave me that bracelet after my aunt died. They said it had been on her wrist. I didn't recognize it, but I thought maybe she'd bought it at some point and I just never noticed. I've kept it in my jewelry box at home." Morrison made notes of everything. "Miss Banks will need you to return the bracelet. It's evidence now and it needs to be returned to Mrs. Chen for proper burial." "Of course," Dorothy said immediately. "I'll FedEx it overnight. Or if you need it sooner, I can drive it over to wherever you need." "We appreciate that," Morrison said. Then she turned to the group gathered around the graves. Here's what appears to have happened. Preston and Son's funeral home handled both funerals within a week of each other. Somehow the coffins were switched. Mr. Chen's mother was placed in Miss Foster's plot, and Miss Foster was placed in Mrs. Chen's plot. The headstones were correct, but the bodies underneath were wrong. How does something like this happen? Patricia asked, her voice sharp with anger. Don't they check? Don't they have systems in place? Morrison sighed. They should. But we're talking about a funeral home that had serious administrative problems. I've been looking into their history more deeply. In 2011 and 2012, there were at least 4 other complaints filed about mix-ups, though nothing as serious as this. Wrong urns given to families, paperwork errors, missed services. The owner, Robert Tillman, was apparently overwhelmed and possibly had early-stage dementia even then, though it wasn't diagnosed until later. Can we sue? David asked. Can we hold someone accountable? The business is defunct, Morrison explained. There's no one to sue. Tillman is in no condition to stand trial for anything, and honestly, I doubt there was criminal intent here. It was negligence, absolutely, but proving criminal negligence would be difficult. The business is gone. The assets were sold off to pay debts years ago. I'm sorry, but there's not much legal recourse available. David felt defeated. His mother had been misplaced like a piece of lost luggage, and no one would be held accountable. It seemed profoundly unfair, but Dorothy put a hand on his shoulder. Maybe there's no legal justice, she said softly, but we can give them both dignity now. We can make sure they're buried in the right places with the right names, with respect and love. That's something. She was right, David realized. As much as he wanted someone to blame, someone to punish, what mattered most was making this right going forward. Morrison continued explaining the next steps. Both coffins will be taken to the funeral home for proper identification and documentation. We'll need dental records or any other identifying information you can provide. Once everything is officially confirmed, both Mrs. Chen and Miss Foster can be reburied in their correct plots. What about the relocation project? David asked suddenly. The whole reason we were moving my mother in the first place. We've contacted the city, Morrison said. Given the unusual circumstances, they're willing to let both graves remain at Riverside Cemetery. They'll work around these 2 plots. It's the least they can do. Over the next several hours, both coffins were carefully documented, photographed, and prepared for transport. David signed what felt like 100 different forms. Dorothy did the same. They exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch through the process. As the sun began to set, David and Patricia finally headed home. David felt emotionally exhausted but also strangely at peace. His mother hadn't been where he thought she was, but she'd been found. That was what mattered. You know what I keep thinking about? David said as they drove. All those times I visited her grave and talked to her. I was talking to a stranger. All my words, all my updates about my life, everything I told her over the years, it wasn't really her. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand. I don't think that's true. Your mother heard you wherever she was. Love doesn't need the right grave. It finds its way. David wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that somehow his mother had felt his presence, even though he'd been standing at the wrong plot. Maybe Patricia was right. Maybe love did find its way. That night, after the kids were asleep, David sat in his home office and wrote everything down. Every detail of the past 2 days, every emotion, every discovery. He needed to record it somehow to make sense of it all. Tomorrow, they'd begin planning the proper reburial. Tomorrow, there'd be more paperwork, more arrangements, more difficult decisions. But tonight, David let himself simply sit with the knowledge that he'd found his mother. After 15 years in the wrong grave, Helen Chen was finally coming home. The next morning, David woke up to find Patricia already in the kitchen, making phone calls. She'd taken it upon herself to start contacting family members, letting them know what had happened. David could hear her on the phone with his Aunt Catherine in Florida, her voice patient as she explained the situation for what must have been the 3rd time. Yes, Catherine, I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's true. They mixed up the bodies 15 years ago. No one was trying to hide anything. It was just a terrible mistake. Yes, David is okay. He's handling it as well as can be expected. David poured himself coffee and waited for Patricia to finish the call. When she hung up, she looked exhausted. Your aunt wants to fly up for the reburial. She's very upset. She kept saying she knew something was wrong back then. though I'm not sure what she means by that. David remembered the tension with his aunt after the funeral. She'd criticized everything from the choice of coffin to the lack of a wake. At the time, David had been too grief-stricken to care about her opinions. Now he wondered if maybe she'd sensed something was off, even if she couldn't have known what. "Let her come," David said. "Mom would want her sister there." Over the next few days, Detective Morrison continued her investigation. She'd discovered something that made the situation even more complicated. Preston and Sons Funeral Home hadn't just mixed up David's mother and Margaret Foster. There had been other cases, too. Morrison came to David's house on Wednesday afternoon to explain what she'd found. She sat in the living room with David and Patricia, a folder full of documents on her lap. "I went through every burial that Preston and Sons handled between 2009 and 2012, she said. "I found evidence of at least 3 other possible mix-ups. In one case, a family received an urn of ashes that DNA testing later proved wasn't their father. In another, a woman's wedding ring was given to the wrong family. These were all settled quietly, with insurance payouts and non-disclosure agreements." David felt sick. "So this happened to other people?" "Yes, and here's the thing. The new owners of Preston and Sons, the people who took over after Tillman was fired, they knew about some of these problems. They tried to fix what they could find, but they didn't do a comprehensive audit of every single burial. They couldn't afford to. The business was already failing. Did they know about my mother?" David asked, his voice tight. "I don't think so. Your case and Miss Foster's case weren't flagged in any of their internal documents. If they'd known, I believe they would have contacted you, based on how they handled the other situations they discovered. But by the time they took over, it was 2 years after your mother's burial, and they were just trying to keep the business afloat. They were putting out fires, not looking for new ones." Patricia leaned forward. "So what happens now? Do other families need to be notified?" "That's what the district attorney is trying to figure out," Morrison said. "We may need to contact families of other people who were buried by Preston and Sons during that time period. It's going to be a sensitive situation. We don't want to cause unnecessary panic, but people have a right to know if there's any chance their loved one might not be where they think they are." David thought about all those families, potentially going through what he'd just experienced. The shock, the violation, the confusion. His heart hurt for them. Later that week, Dorothy Banks invited David and Patricia to lunch. They met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and a menu full of comfort food. Dorothy was already there when they arrived, the jade bracelet sitting in a small velvet box on the table in front of her. "I wanted to return this in person," she said, pushing the box toward David. "I'm so sorry I had it all these years. If I'd known..." David opened the box and looked at the bracelet. Even tarnished and aged, it was still beautiful. "You didn't know," he said gently. "None of us knew. You have nothing to apologize for." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I keep thinking about my aunt. She was buried under the wrong name for 15 years. Every time I visited that grave and talked to her, it wasn't even her. And your poor mother, buried under a stranger's name with no one knowing she was there." "But she had visitors," David said suddenly, the realization hitting him. "You visited once a year. You brought flowers. My mother wasn't completely alone. In a strange way, your aunt looked after her." Dorothy smiled through her tears. "I never thought of it that way. That's actually kind of beautiful." They spent the next hour talking about their loved ones. Dorothy told stories about her Aunt Margaret, about how she'd taught second grade for 40 years, how she'd had a cat named Mr. Whiskers who she'd loved more than anything, how she'd made the best apple pie in the county. David shared memories of his mother, how she'd worked 2 jobs to support them, how she'd never complained even when things were hard, how she'd saved every penny to send him to college, how she'd been the strongest person he'd ever known. "They sound like they were both wonderful women," Patricia said. "It's a shame they never met. I think they would have gotten along. Maybe they do know each other now," Dorothy said softly, "wherever they are. Maybe this whole mix-up brought them together in some way." David liked that idea. He liked thinking that his mother and Margaret Foster, 2 women who'd never met in life, might have found some kind of connection through this bizarre situation. The following Monday, David met with Jennifer at the funeral home to plan the reburial. He brought the jade bracelet with him. Jennifer handled it carefully, promising it would be placed back on his mother's wrist before the casket was sealed. "We're going to do this right," Jennifer said firmly. I know my company didn't handle the original burial, but I feel a responsibility to make sure everything is perfect this time. Your mother deserves that. They went over every detail. David chose a new casket, nicer than the one his mother had been buried in originally. He could afford it now, and he wanted to do something special for her. He selected new flowers, new programs for the service, even a better headstone. I couldn't afford much back then, David explained to Jennifer. I was just out of college, barely making any money. I did the best I could, but it was so basic. Now I can give her something better. Jennifer put a hand on his arm. David, your mother knew you loved her. The casket and the flowers, those things don't matter as much as you think. What matters is that you cared enough to fight for her, to make sure she was found and treated with dignity. That's real love. David appreciated her words, but he still wanted to do this. It felt important, like a way of making up for lost time. His Aunt Catherine arrived on Thursday, 2 days before the scheduled reburial. David picked her up from the airport, and they had an awkward conversation during the drive to her hotel. They hadn't seen each other in years, and there was still tension between them from old disagreements. But when Catherine saw the jade bracelet, something shifted. She held it in her hands and started crying. I gave this to your mother, she said quietly. Not your grandfather. That was just the story she told. I bought it for her when she was pregnant with you. I was teaching English in China at the time, and I found it in a little shop in Beijing. I wanted her to have something special to mark your arrival. David stared at his aunt in shock. Why did she say it was from grandfather? Catherine smiled sadly. Because we had a fight right after you were born. Something stupid about how she was raising you. I said some things I shouldn't have. We didn't speak for almost a year. When we finally made up, it was easier for her to say the bracelet was from our father. Less complicated. But I always knew the truth, and so did she. This revelation changed something in David. The bracelet wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of his mother and his aunt's relationship, of reconciliation and forgiveness. And now his aunt was here, helping to bury her sister properly after all these years. Saturday arrived bright and clear. The reburial service was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Riverside Cemetery. About 40 people attended, a bigger gathering than his mother's original funeral. Word had spread about what happened, and former neighbors, old co-workers of his mother's, and even some people who'd just read about the story in the local newspaper showed up to pay their respects. Dorothy Banks was there too, standing near Margaret Foster's grave, which was being prepared for her aunt's proper reburial later that afternoon. The two services had been coordinated to happen the same day, a way of acknowledging that these two women's stories had become forever intertwined. The pastor who'd conducted his mother's original funeral had passed away, so David had found a different minister, a younger woman named